Well, shalom all. My name is Todd Bennett, and I am providing the weekly Shabbat message and update from January 29th, 2022 on the Roman calendar. Today is actually day 25 of month 11, also known as January 29th, 2022, according to the Roman calendar, named after Pope Gregory. It's the Gregorian calendar, and most people don't even realize that the time system that we're operating under is named after a former pope of the Roman Catholic religion. So we're actually under Roman time. And as usual, time is heavily on my mind. I just drove 3 days from freezing, snowy, stormy New York and arrived in Texas right before sunset. And sunset marked the beginning of the weekly Shabbat, and I'm very thankful for safe passage followed by the gift of a much needed rest. I haven't actually mastered the art of driving and typing yet, and I'm pretty exhausted, so this will be brief, but an important message. My trip was nothing short of a whirlwind, and it could have been disastrous, and as usual, though, I turned it around into a victory. And in fact, most of us experience Red Sea moments on a smaller scale, of course, but they're there to prepare us for the bigger ones that lie ahead. And the test is always whether we'll panic at the sight of Pharaoh and his army, or whether we'll put our faith and trust in Yah. How we react is really the test, and it's the key to moving forward. Many people actually confront situations with fear and trepidation, and as a result, they, hunker down and shrink away and fail to proceed forward. And I think that's the overriding message that we've seen throughout the scriptures. David, confronting Goliath while the whole army of Israel and King Saul were, hiding. It's just a pattern that keeps repeating. And of course, our actions are our works, and they demonstrate our faith and whether we truly believe the promises and trust in Yah. And speaking of giants, we often forget that Abraham was also in that position. And we first read that Abraham's belief was accounted to him for righteousness, and his life was a demonstration of faith in action. He left the comforts of Babylon and entered into Canaan. Now, Canaan was a land filled with giants, and we often forget that, but he trusted the promises of Elohim. And interestingly, he was promised seed if he went into this land filled with giants, where giants were renowned for eating people. I mean, it's not just childhood fairy tales. That's things we learn in First Enoch. But he was promised seed if he went into this land of where they devoured people, and that promise was fulfilled through Yisrael. Yisrael was ultimately the seed of Abraham, but they later refused to enter into the land because they feared for the lives of their children, the very descendants that were promised to Abraham. So it's ironic, to say the least. Well, Abraham's excuse me. While Abraham's belief resulted in obedience, Israel's disbelief resulted in disobedience. And obedience leads to good fruit, and disobedience leads to bad fruit. That is just a bedrock scriptural principle. And as we discussed last week, we can either bear good fruit or we can bear bad fruit. Now, you might hear a lot of sermons on this subject, and you'll likely hear a lot of different opinions as well as to what constitutes good fruit and bad fruit. I grew up in a mainstream Christian denomination thinking that winning souls was the goal of being a Christian and the ultimate sign that you were bearing fruit. So, of course, these mega churches, and Billy Graham was the ultimate soul winner. So he was a mega Christian because he was leading more souls to Christ, and winning souls for the kingdom. And of course, winning souls obviously involved getting people saved. Now, I later learned the fallacy of that thinking, since the typical evangelistic formula for salvation is so weak. The notion that a person is saved by raising their hand, answering an altar call, or asking Jesus into their heart has no scriptural precedent whatsoever. You're not truly saved until you hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and you're granted entry into the kingdom by the Master. And I wrote about this in my book entitled "Salvation: The Covenant Journey." Sadly, there are likely millions of Christians who believe that they're going to heaven when they die because they said a prayer or they made a decision at one point in their life, or they raised their hand or they ran up to the altar and had somebody pray for them. Sadly, that decision or prayer was only the entry point to what was supposed to be a covenant journey that leads them to that point, that leads them to uh, uh, them being granted access to the kingdom. It did not provide them with a free ticket to heaven just because of that simple act. Of course, that's the distortion of the concept of grace that has so consumed Christianity, that we're saved by grace. Of course, we are, in the sense that grace is a free gift. The grace is a free gift. Yeshua died for us, shed his blood. That blood atones for our sins. That is the grace. He did that. We couldn't be clean in and of ourselves. We couldn't do enough good works to wash ourselves clean. Only his blood could cleanse us, and that is the grace. Okay, but once we have been cleansed, then we have an obligation to follow the words of Yeshua and to obey him. So you don't get a free ticket to heaven just because you made a decision. And there's also millions who think they will be raptured simply because they identify as a Christian. Just because you call yourself a Christian doesn't mean anything. I've written before about my time spent in Cambridge and Massachusetts, which the churches there are amazing. You can see Baptist churches and Methodist churches and all that, and they have all these political slogans and all sorts of LGBTQ flags and so many things that just go contrary to the scriptures. But of course, they call themselves Christians, and they think because they call themselves Christians, they get all the promises associated with the Messiah. But that's they're going to be sadly mistaken someday. And of course, some use the writings of Paul as a prescription for salvation, but even then, they're typically not following the covenant path that leads to salvation. For instance, in my past Christian evangelistic efforts, I used to quote Romans 10 from an English translation as follows, starting at 9, that if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So basically, you would think that just say that Jesus is Lord, and then I believe that God raised him from the dead. You say that, you're saved. Poof, immediately. Of course, we know that the name Jesus is an English invention with no etymological connection to the English name Joshua or the Hebrew name Yahushua. So Yahushua is his name. That's the name, and many Bibles have it in English as Joshua. So even by doing that, you're not really saying the right name, because of course we know there was no J in Hebrew, and Joshua was not what they called the Messiah when he walked on this earth. His name was Yeshua and is Yeshua, and no matter if people try to change it, that's not going to change anything. And so Jesus has no connection to either the English version, if you want to call it that, or his actual Hebrew name, Yeshua. Now, I'm sure, yes, you can go on the internet, I know I've done it, and you will find people who perform linguistic acrobats to make it work. They'll try to show you how Jesus actually is connected to the Hebrew name, Yeshua or Yahushua. but they simply are trying to justify a lie. It's just not true. So that's important to understand that they're getting the name wrong right off the bat. When Peter was speaking to his fellow Judeans in Hebrew, he was on Shabbat, and that first started in Acts 2. I'm sorry, no, this was a different event, but in Acts 4, when he was speaking to his fellow Judeans in Hebrew, he was using the Hebrew name Yeshua when referring to the resurrection of the Messiah. And he specifically stated in that incident, nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. So, no other name. It's not optional. So, we need to get the name right when we consider, salvation, when we consider what we do, who we acknowledge, who we put our trust and faith in for salvation. When you use the name Yeshua, you're clearly referring to the Son of Elohim, and that name provides the very key to salvation. Yeshua means Yah saves. Yod He Vav He. Yah saves. Yahuwah saves. Now, this is consistent with the prophecy of Yoel, which proclaims that those who call upon the name of Yahuwah shall be saved. And we read about that in Joel 2:32. When you use the name Jesus, you're referring to Isus, a child of Zeus. And that is, look, you want to talk about etymological connections. Isus was the name of a healing god, a child of Zeus. So there's your direct connection to Zeus with that name. So Jesus is etymologically connected to Zeus. So the English translation of Romans 10 falls woefully short when considering the issue of the name that provides salvation. When you examine the text further, you see that it does not simply involve reciting a four-step prayer at one time, but rather making Yeshua Lord, or better yet, Master of your life. When you make someone your master, it means that you submit to their will and follow their instructions from that point onward. It's a decision followed by continuous action. It's life-changing and life-controlling. When you confess that someone is your master, the words of that confession will be reflected by the way that you live your life. Your works are the evidence of the belief that you have in your heart. Therefore, salvation is not a box that's checked because of a momentary act or decision. It's the destination and the ultimate outcome from walking with Elohim throughout your life according to his covenant, the covenant renewed by the blood of Yeshua. Now, sadly, many Christians don't really make Yeshua their master. Instead, they grab some snippets from one or more of Paul's letters to completely ignore the crystal clear teachings of Yeshua. Now, many do this unwittingly because that's what they've been taught. And they end up making Paul, or their understanding of Paul, their master instead of Yeshua, the Messiah. And I wrote about that in my book titled The Christian Conundrum. The goal is that we want our names to be written in the scroll of life. I therefore suggest submission to the one with the authority to write it in or blot it out. And I can say with certainty that Paul does not have that authority. So if you decide to submit to Paul or an interpretation of one of his letters that contravenes the words of Yeshua, that either does, specifically, or you interpret it in such a way, well, you're doing so at your own risk. And here's what the Messiah says about the matter. Revelation 3:5 says, "He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of, or the scroll of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his messengers." So here we see Yeshua claiming authority to blot someone's name out of the scroll of life. We further read in Revelation 20:15, "And anyone not found written in the scroll of life was cast into the lake of fire." Of course, that's the same fate as the branches that do not bear fruit through Yeshua. See, this all circles back to the issue of bearing fruit. In John 15:5-6, Yeshua says, I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I in him, bears much fruit. For without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. It's also the fate of the bad trees bearing bad fruit that Yeshua talked about in Matthew 7:17-21. It says, even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. Not everyone who says to me, Master, Master, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. So, the Christian understanding of winning souls does not necessarily constitute good fruit if it does not involve a recognition of the Master Yeshua and a life of obedience to the will of the Father. Again, many times I would see people go to a Christian crusade, and they would be told to come up to the altar, say a prayer, raise their hand, make a confession, and then go read the Bible or go get a Gospel of John, and then go find a local church. But the emphasis was really on the act that took place at that service or that crusade, and the emphasis was not on therefore going and obeying. In fact, if they went to their local church, they would probably be told, no, that Jesus nailed the law to the cross. We don't have to obey the commandments. So the whole evangelical paradigm is backwards and upside down, and does not put people on the path of the covenant, and therefore does not put them on the path to salvation. I've always used a passage in Daniel as my guide. Daniel 12:3 says, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. The implication is the wise are the ones who turn many to righteousness. And now that sounds like good fruit to me, and that has been my guiding principle. Turning people to righteousness involves turning people to the Torah. The righteousness of Yah is outlined in his Torah. His instructions, his commandments are actually a reflection of his righteousness, and they show us how to live righteous lives. They are not there to put us into bondage so that he could send his son to later do away with those instructions and commandments. That's just simply absurd. Next week, I'll explore further the connection between bearing good fruit and being wise, and we'll look at other common misconceptions concerning good fruit and how to know for certain whether our fruit is good or bad in the eyes of Yeshua. Now, I began this message by talking about time, and we know that the two great lights in the heavens are witnesses to Yah's calendar and his appointed times. We read about that in Genesis 1:14. In Daniel, we read that the wise are likened to the lights in the firmament, and that's because the wise are also witnesses. As we walk in the Torah, we witness regarding the Shabbat every week with our lives, and when we follow the appointed times and keep his commandments, we are witnesses. And next week, the wise will be looking up at the lights in the firmament to sight the renewal of the moon, which will mark the beginning of month 12. The wise will be sounding their shofars because they understand the importance of discerning the times so that they can be prepared and ready for the Master, the one who provides salvation. So I recommend that you join the congregation of the wise next week and look up and get your shofar and make a noise and be a witness to the renewal of the moon, which is a symbol of the renewal of the covenant. And as a final note, for all you who prayed for Sister Donna, I'm happy to report that she's feeling much better and has transitioned out of the hospital and into rehab. I spoke with her on the phone, and we've been texting, and she seems to be doing much, much better, and she appreciates your prayers, and so do I. So thank you all for your prayers. Until next week, Barakot, and you can go sign up for the written newsletters. The one I've just read gets sent out, and I send out to a mailing list that I have every week, Yah willing. And you can go to the website, www.shemaisrael.net. And if you go there, you'll pop up, a pop-up screen will come down where you can sign up for the newsletter. You can also check out past articles, newsletters, resources, and there's also a link to our shop where you can order ebooks or printed books or other shofars and different things that we read about in the Torah that help our walk in the covenant. So until next week, shalom, barakot, and be blessed.